Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, indeed, I am Ewen Maclean, Principal with the Berkeley Research Group. We're a relatively new company, set up in 2010 in the US, but in 3 short years, we've already organically grown to over 600 staff and turning over 200 million US. So we're quite a sizable entity already. Typically, we're involved with offering expert services to the finance industries, banking and healthcare, as well as construction, which is where I come in, and I lead the construction expert services in London, although my remit really is the rest of the world as well. And I typically get involved in sort of litigation support, expert witness testimony, as well as sort of delay damages and quantum assessment and arbitration. So it's from that background that I give you today's seminar on forensic schedule analysis and how to find the truth. So that's a bit more about me. The structure of my talk today, I'm just going to briefly introduce forensic schedule analysis before coming on to ask the question, well, why do schedules become distorted? I'm going to identify the sources of information that the forensic schedule analyst uses to find the truth. And then I'm going to provide some worked examples of schedules that are distorted, because I just feel that sometimes when you can see deceptive schedules in practice and you can identify where they're misleading, it helps you find the truth by looking at actual worked examples. And then I'll summarize the variables that you should review in your schedules and look at some validation protocols. And then towards the end, I'll just touch a bit on how software analysis can assist before summarizing and taking any questions. So what is forensic schedule analysis? It's about retrospectively, i.e. with the benefit of hindsight, investigating the schedule to identify the delays that have occurred on a project, and more crucially, identify the responsibility for those delays and identify cause and effect. There's no formal standard practice for forensic schedule analysis, but there are some documents out there that are particularly useful. The first of those is the American Association of Cost Engineers International Recommended Practice number 29R. And that's freely downloadable off the internet, and I'd recommend it to people to use. As well as some other documents that assist in looking at the integrity of schedules, the Defense Contract Management Agency's PAM 200 document and the United States Government Accountability Office Schedule Assessment Guide. I'd say that I'd recommend them all, although then they don't necessarily suit every single case that you might come across. And I do have 1 or 2 issues with the documents, some of the things that they recommend. But generally speaking, they're a pretty good start. And I'll touch on some of their content a little bit later in my talk. Now, forensic schedule analysis is about finding the truth. It's not about promoting unmeritorious claims or rebutting valid claims. It is about getting to the truth. And if you ever have to give evidence as an expert witness in court, you've got to remember that you have a duty to the court beyond that of your client to tell the truth. And believe me, if you're in court, they will find out if you're not telling the truth. I'd also say that although I look at things forensically, it's a real benefit if parties can agree an accepted program on a project. If you haven't got an accepted program, it puts the project at additional risk. But if you have an accepted program, then the project will benefit, and if the project benefits, both the client and the contractor should benefit. Okay, so why do schedules come distorted? A schedule should record the true historic position of a project and realistically forecast the outstanding works in a reliable and logical way. But that doesn't always happen. Why? Well, the first reason I would suggest is that of human error. Schedules have thousands of activities, maybe tens of thousands of activities, with many more logical relationships between them. And when you have such a huge amount of data to process, it's actually quite reasonable to expect that errors will be made. The second reason I suggest why schedules become distorted relates to the practicalities of planning. For example, you might have an activity within your program for some element of design, and that design is completed and it's marked as 100% complete in your schedule. 6 months later, that design has to be revisited. And the scheduler looks at his schedule, and there's been a significant amount of subsequent works carried out already. So he says to himself, why do I really need to go back and revisit that original design element to say, oh, it's now not 100% complete, it's now something less. And yet, when you look at these things forensically, you would perhaps get one party trying to look at the design dates or the dates that design documents were passed off from documentation, compare that to those dates within the schedule, and say that they're different, and then try and paint a picture that your schedule is totally unreliable. So sometimes the practicalities of planning mean that the schedule is always not updated ideally. In that particular situation, when you've got redesign or anything new, I would always recommend inserting a new activity into the program. The third reason why schedules become distorted are the quality or the compatibility of records. Activity, let's take a foundations activity, and that could be measured, the progress could be measured by the number of foundations poured, it could be measured by the volume of concrete poured, the cubic meters of concrete that are poured. And that site management method of measurement needs to reflect what the schedule is measuring progress by as well. Otherwise, you can get distortions within your program. We also need to look at the skill of the planner. By way of example here, I'd give, say, a steelwork activity, a 6-week steelwork activity. There's a variation issued, which requires 2 weeks' worth more of additional work. A good planner would insert a new, or I would say, a good planner would insert a new activity for those 2 weeks' worth of additional work. But I often come across a situation where a new activity isn't inserted and progress is still monitored against the original steelwork activity. And then that 6-week steelwork activity, surprise, surprise, finishes 2 weeks late, 8 weeks. Now, forensically, we can come in and we can explain that 2 weeks by the additional work and from the variation. But equally, when there's someone else on the other side arguing the case against you, they may confuse matters by saying, oh, you, Mr. Contractor, had a load of culpable delay, so we're not going to perhaps grant you an EOT if that was due. The fifth reason why I say schedules might become distorted are the settings in transmitting schedules. I've seen just recently, actually, a case where it was a P6 schedule was exported by the contractor. The project manager, under an NEC contract, imported that same schedule, but he didn't use the same settings for the calendars and the like and update those settings. So you actually had a situation where two parties thought they were looking at the same schedule, but actually they were different, and they were significantly different because plan completion was nearly 2 weeks different. And then finally, I'm going to acknowledge why do schedules become distorted through willful manipulation. So there are parties out there that might try and manipulate the program for their own commercial advantage. But I just wanted to really emphasize that planning and scheduling is not a simple task, and there can be distortions in the program for accidental reasons rather than unscrupulous reasons. So what are the sources that the forensic schedule analyst goes to start looking at projects with the benefit of hindsight retrospectively? The first document to consider is unsurprisingly perhaps the baseline schedule or the as-planned program. You should seek to validate that baseline, that it's fully scoped, its logic is credible, its durations of activities are sensible. And I'll talk about more specific details later in the talk, but I perhaps just want to highlight here with the baseline schedule that is the benchmark or yardstick by which you will often measure delay on your project. And if your baseline schedule is wrong or is distorted, any comparison with it is going to produce meaningless results. So it's very important to make sure your baseline is correct, and when I examine a program, will correct errors in the baseline. The as-built schedule is also vitally important. It's based upon factual data. So if I'm in court, I will, when I'm dealing with the lawyers very much like the as-built dates. They like fact, fact, fact. It's what actually happened. The baseline schedule is about forecasting, and things may not materialize as one party intends, so you can always argue about it, but you can't really argue with the as-built schedule. And you can verify the dates in your as-built schedule by reference to documents, allocations, sheets, site diaries, etc., etc. But actually what I find is the more crucial question with as-built schedules is that parties generally agree on the historic position of what's actually happened. It's factual. The real question to answer for the forensic schedule analyst is who is responsible for those delays and apportioning those delays, i.e. demonstrating cause and effect. Oops, sorry. We then have the schedule updates, the interim progress updates between the baseline and the as-built schedule. The historical data in the progress updates can be checked in the same way as an as-built schedule, and the forecast data from the progress date forwards can be analysed in the same way that perhaps a baseline schedule would be. But the crucial thing with schedule updates, looking at those, is monitoring all the variables that are input into a program between updates, because that is probably the easiest way to insert a deceptive feature, which I'm shortly going to demonstrate as well. So the first three sources all relate to the schedules, but sometimes we come at it from a different perspective. We start looking at the documentation and forming a picture around the delay events themselves. And then when we form that picture, we compare it to what the schedule is telling us. Because the best accuracy that the analyst, the forensic schedule analyst, can really hope for is an objective reflection of the facts as represented by the documents. That's when your case will stand up. That's when your case will win the day in court. Right, I'm quite keen to get on to providing some scenarios. As I say, when you look at practical examples, I think people relate to them, and when they see what to look for, you'll be able to go away from today and better recognise them perhaps in a schedule. So what I've done here is I've provided a baseline schedule. It's a very simple program, but it basically relates to two buildings, Building 1 and Building 2, with exactly the same sequence of works. It starts on the 20th of September 2013 and starts with excavations, followed by foundations, substructure, superstructure, M&E, cladding and fit-out works in a fairly standard sequence, one starting after the other. And then exactly the same sequence is provided in Building 2. There is a shared excavation resource, so the excavation of Building 2 cannot start until the excavation in Building 1 has been completed. When both sequences of work have been finished, there is a commissioning period, and plan completion occurs on the 17th of April. So that's our baseline program. And now I'm going to apply half a dozen scenarios about how we can manipulate things and distort programs. And the first scenario I wish to consider is progress override versus retained logic, which are settings in most schedule software that relate to the logic within the general sequence of works. What we can see in this schedule is that I've updated the baseline 4 weeks later at the 18th of October with some progress. So everything to the left of the blue data line is as built, historical data, and everything to the right is forecast. The yellow bars represent the planned sequence of work in the original baseline. So what we can see here is that the excavation in building 1 has fallen behind the planned progress. It should have been complete by the 18th of October, but there's still some work to do. However, the contractor has actually managed to bring an additional excavation resource to site, and he's been able to progress some of the works in building 2, as shown by the blue bar ahead of the planned yellow works, or planned yellow works. The program here has been rescheduled. Rescheduling is a mathematical calculation allowing for critical path analysis to complete the outstanding works within the logical constraints of the program in the minimum amount of time. And it has rescheduled the works on this schedule according to the logic in the original baseline program. And the completion date still stays at the 17th of April, but the float in building 1 is now 10 days. If we just go back to the original baseline program, it was 20 days. So the progress that is achieved has not altered the planned completion date, and yet but the float to building 1 general sequence of works has reduced to 10 days. But as I said, it's used the logic from the baseline program. It's retained that logic. But we've actually, if you like, violated that logic by achieving out-of-sequence progress. So this activity of excavation in building 2 can actually be completed earlier. There's no reason why it can't be completed earlier. So what happens when I don't use retained logic and override the progress by changing the setting in the software? This activity comes back. We'll just look at that again. It starts here, progress overrides, and it comes back. And you'll immediately see that building 1 has become critical as well, which could be very convenient for someone who perhaps has a compensable event in building 1. So there isn't any float on the program at all now. The planned completion date has actually come back to the 3rd of April. So you may think, well, that's not so bad because no EOT is due, no liquidated damages are applicable. But the reality of the situation is that this update might become the baseline for comparing with the next progress update to see whether any delays have occurred. So it's crucial that you've applied progress override or retain logic in the right way on this program, even if it does bring the completion date back. Right, the next scenario I wish to consider relates to calendars. Slightly, perhaps a simpler one to progress override and retain logic. The starting point is the update at the 18th of October with as-built progress to the left, forecast work to the right, and excavation works in building 2 being allowed to commence from the data date going forward. But because we've entered the month of October, winter's coming. And if winter's coming, we've potentially got reduced working hours available to our excavation gangs. So what I've done is, in this building 1 with excavation, there's a calendar related to it of 8 hours of working a day, and I've reduced that calendar to 7 hours of working per day. But I've conveniently forgotten to do it to the excavation activity of building 2. So now, what effect is that going to have? Let's have a look. Again, the critical path is beginning to dance around. You can start seeing how a forensic schedule analysis can manage how the program performs. And because there aren't so many hours in the day available for this excavation activity to be carried out, it takes a little bit longer, pushes the sequence of work out, and it becomes critical. And there's now a day's worth of float with the excavation. To building 2. The next distortion I wish to look at relates to logical relationships. So perhaps ought to just say in that previous slide, the completion date's now gone out to the 7th of April. So the next slide shows the same program, completion at the 7th of April, but this time I'm going to adjust some logic. In between the cladding and fit-out activities in Building 1, there's a finish-to-start relationship. So the fit-out can't start until the cladding is finished, and you can see that denoted by the line from the end of the cladding activity. I'm going to change that relationship to a start-to-start relationship, so the line will come from the start of the cladding to the fit-out and apply an 8-day lead. This has the following effect. I've just manipulated the program schedule such that the critical path has gone back to Building 2. We can see here that the logical relationship is shown differently. It does show correctly a start-to-start relationship, and you can see that there's a little bit of an overlap now between the cladding and the fit-out. And you might say to yourself, well, that's fairly easy to pick up, but this is a very, very simple program. Just think of all the programs with tens of thousands of activities in. Would you pick that up? Not by the naked eye. And sometimes you get submissions, interim submissions or progress updates that concentrate just on the works around being carried out at time now, around the day-to-day. So it can be very hard to pick those up without carrying out significant amount of data analysis. It can be made even more difficult in the next scenario by regrouping and resorting the program. The information in this schedule here is exactly the same as in that one, in the previous slide. All I have done is rearranged the activities. In this first slide, it's the general sequence of work per building, Building 1 and Building 2. In this next slide, I've put the earthworks activities together for Building 1 and Building 2, the foundations activities together for Building 1 and Building 2, etc., etc. And you can suddenly say, wow, that looks a completely different schedule. If we come down to the cladding and the fit-out, you can just about detect that there is a slight overlap between this fit-out activity here and the cladding there. And of course, you'll note, well, perhaps you'll pick up, I haven't put the network on. I haven't shown the logical relationships. So again, if I'm up to no good, not that I would be, but perhaps if someone else would be, they might employ these sorts of tactics. So, that is exactly the same. We can take foundations, Building 1, the 25th of November 2013, foundations, 25th November 2013. It's exactly the same. The fifth scenario I wish to consider relates to constraints and negative total float. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that this foundations activity in Building 1, although it's shown at the moment to complete on the 25th of November, I'm going to put a constraint on that activity that it must finish on or before the 21st of November 2013. When I do that, let's see what happens. That activity goes critical. Hasn't altered the subsequent works thereafter. But if I wanted to perhaps say that there's been a compensation event that's occurred against the foundation in building 1, then I might just have achieved an objective of saying it's critical when it perhaps wasn't. A couple of things to note here are, firstly, this is a Primavera P6 program, that the foundation's activity still actually shows a finish date of the 25th of November 2013, even though I've told it it must finish by the 21st of November 2013. So how do you pick up that there's a constraint there? Well, in P6 and other software is different. There's a little asterisk there. But what you should do is there's all sorts of data that could be available to you if more columns on the left-hand side of the schedule were shown. And you need to make sure, if you're testing a program and validating it, that you get that information provided to you, which directly tells you if an activity has a constraint on it. Perhaps something that's more telling on this slide is now the appearance of negative total float. These two activities, excavation and foundation, now have total float of -2 days. And this highlights a great difference between the planner or scheduler and the forensic schedule analyst. A planner might say to himself, okay, there are 2 days of negative total float. I will address that by applying some more resources. I might address that by resequencing my work to recover a delay. The forensic schedule analyst looks at this rather more cynically, because everything has now happened, and he says, or she says, that if there's negative total float, you can't actually achieve the schedule as you've set it out to be. And if that is critical, if the activity that there is negative total float with it, you won't be entitled to an EOT or a revision to the completion date, because you can't achieve what you are saying that you can. Now, I don't like using constraints. I'd recommend that they're used very, very sparingly. Always try and use logical relationships. I do acknowledge there are occasions when they're required. If you do use constraints, try and make sure they're soft constraints, not hard constraints. And what I mean by that is soft constraints are start on or after. So it's saying an activity must start on this date, but it is allowed to move out afterwards. If you say an activity must start on this date and no other date, there's no room in the, for maneuverability in the program. The program cannot behave dynamically, and and to that extent, it can distort the program. You can get all sorts of negative total float in your schedules. I've come across cases where I see nothing but negative total float in the schedule, of -300 days, -400 days. And it actually masks the critical path, because it's not necessarily the sequence of works with the largest negative total float that's critical. It might just be the largest negative total float because it's going to a particular constraint in the program. Okay, so that's constraints and negative total float. The last example I want to give about what to look for in a schedule to find the truth are increased labour resources. So I've got the same program here, but what I've done underneath is provide the resources that are applicable to the schedule, except I've filtered it as well just for the excavation activities. And what we can see with the histogram are the resources required by the yellow columns. The blue columns represent the actual labour that's been used, and the green columns represent the forecast labour that's required. So you can see to the right of the blue line, the data line, the forecast labour is actually quite a lot more than what was originally planned in yellow, and more than what's actually been achieved to date in blue. Now, it might be perfectly feasible that you can get those resources to site, but there might be limits on the resources available, and that might not therefore be possible. And if I didn't have the resources shown on the program, I would just be looking at the sequence of works and thinking, well, it's possibly achievable. But it's only when I look at the resources that I actually start thinking, well, I'm going to have to examine this because I don't know whether they can actually get those resources to site. And I often find that the benefit of bringing additional resources to site diminishes as work phases become less available, or there's trade stacking or congestion of resources on site, such that if you double your resource, you don't necessarily double the productivity. Just another area to look at, increased labour resources. Okay, so I've provided some examples, and I've also provided a list here of variables to be reviewed for variance in your schedules, which are the sorts of things that I look at forensically. The keen potential forensic schedule analysts amongst you might already pick up on I've actually duplicated number 7 and number 10, durations. Apologies for that. I submitted the presentation last week and didn't have time to a chance to correct it. So these are variables in the program or schedule. Whenever there is a variable that has to be entered into the program, it represents an opportunity for possibly a human error, possibly a mistake, or a deception. So you need to look at all these items. I've addressed item 1, calendar, and I've provided examples with the logic and the relationships, constraints, negative floats, reorganizing activities, progress override. So I've given you a bit of a flavour of some of these already. I haven't got time to go through them all now, but I don't know, hammocks. Hammocks are an interesting one. Hammocks which can represent a group or sequence of activities. You can run a critical path analysis which shows that one of those activities in the hammock is critical, but the software you're using turns the whole hammock, with a hammock bar representing that sequence of activities, shows it as critical. Now, the skilled planner and scheduler will pick that up, but maybe someone who's not so used to dealing with schedules may not realise that it's only one activity within the hammock that's critical. So it's important to realise or monitor people who perhaps are suggesting that a whole hammock and everything within it is critical when only one activity is critical. But I think the worked examples sort of better illustrate how these variables can alter schedules. Right, validation protocols. I've referred to the 4 sources that the forensic schedule analyst uses to find the truth or investigate programs, namely the baseline schedule, the progress updates, the as-built schedule, and the documents. However, for even these sources of information to be relied upon, they need to be validated. And therefore, I've set out some protocols that are broadly based upon the RP29 documents that I referred to earlier, although not entirely, because I don't agree with everything that's in those. And the approach to validating your sources of information is to maximize the reliability of the source data, not necessarily to sort of assure that the underlying data is valid. And what I mean by that is your schedule needs to reflect a piling record saying that there was a pile installed on the 5th of October. It's not, the forensic schedule analyst can't go that step further, that if someone has entered the date on the contemporary record for installing that pile on the 5th of October incorrectly, he's perhaps misrepresented it as the 5th of September, schedule analysis can't go that far. It just validates the data that is used within the schedule as reflecting what is in the contemporary records. So, starting with the baseline. A good quality baseline will capture all the activities in the project. It will sequence them, it will establish the durations, it will identify a critical path, it will identify the float that's available, etc. But to validate everything that's in there, we need to firstly ensure that the full scope is represented. Can have missing activities within the program. You need to make sure your work breakdown structure is in sufficient detail. I would acknowledge here that if you're on a project that's, say, a couple of years long, it's not necessary to plan all the activities in your program that are still over a year away from being scheduled to the nearest day. But you should certainly be looking at the next 3 months' worth of work, having that planned in sufficient detail. Try and make sure the activities that relate to either party are separate. Don't confuse matters by having activities where there's a joint responsibility. Activities should have at least one predecessor and one successor, with the exception of the start milestone and the completion milestone. It's not always essential. Sometimes it frustrates me a little bit. I come across situations now, and apologies to project managers in the room, but they might run some software and it will say, well, you've got 322 activities with excessive total float in them. Therefore, your program's not accepted. I say, let's go a step further. You know, what do those activities relate to? If it relates to, say, car park activities, which are insignificant compared to the major works that have been carried out with the building, then it's not necessarily the end of the world if there's float on those activities. Ensure the calendars are truly represented. I sometimes see lazy planning. If we go back to an example of what I used on the earthworks, a contractor may say, well, I can only achieve 80% productivity in the winter. So he says, right, I'll just say that it's a 4-day working week. What happens when a delay event happens on a Friday when the contractor's not working? Or maybe he doesn't work on a Friday, I don't know. You should try and make sure calendars are truly representative. Show the number of working hours per day across the 5 days and just reduce the number of hours. Document the basis of constraints, replace them if necessary, and make sure you've got the correct start date.
On the calendars, really, according to the company or the contractor dealing with the thing, they have got their own way of standardizing their calendars anyway, so you need to change it afterwards, really. They're adopting a standardized calendar of their scheduling.
I would say yes. Dare I say it? I guess one thing which might make me different to many people in the room, I have to look at things with great rigour and scrutiny because I stand up in court and I will get found out. And lawyers tend to have a habit of making something that's not that significant look a lot more significant than it actually is. So what I'd say also is look at the scale and the complexity of your project. I get involved in projects worth millions to billions. If you're just working on a sort of small 3-month schedule, etc., you're not going to necessarily come across all these issues and address them in the same way that I would. I think you've got to douse it with a sense of practicality. But I would still try and achieve good recommend practice, which is model things accurately. Make sure you've got the correct start date. Believe it or not, I see cases where people haven't used the correct start dates and that the program is scheduled to complete in the earliest amount of time. And you should obviously have it, well, I say obviously, but you should have at least one continuous critical path. Using the longest path, I generally prefer the longest path to the critical path, although I would still always try and qualify the longest path and that is basically starting with the first activity, having a continuous chain of activities straight through to the end. If you use the critical path setting in software, that can be affected by constraints. But equally, when you're using the longest path, you have to be aware of those constraints. So it's, I say I prefer the longest path, that's where I start, but I always verify things looking at the critical path settings thereafter. And make sure contract provisions are represented as well. If the contract says something, that is your master, really. Most contracts are quite simple. They provide a program for you. There's a start date and there's a finish date, and that's your program. These schedules are just setting about how you would go about doing it in between those two dates. So the most important document is the contract. What about the as-built schedule? Time's running a bit short, so I'm going to perhaps start to motor. I apologise. But day-to-day, after the event's been considered, it seems like common sense, but believe me, I see claim submissions that don't necessarily reflect that. Activities to the left of the day-to-day or the time now are historical and should have actual start and finish dates. Activities to the right shouldn't have actual start and finish dates. Use contemporary records, the allocation sheets, the site diaries, photographs, etc. to confirm as-built dates in the schedule. Interview site staff. Your scheduler on site, your planner on site will be a wealth of knowledge. He will have a very good idea, or she will have a very good idea of the reliability of the data used in the schedule. Check activity descriptions haven't changed. What might have been a certain activity, A1000 in the baseline schedule, might miraculously have had its activity description changed by the end. So are you comparing apples with apples? Check the scope of the activities for the as-built data reflects that scope. Sometimes I might see an activity, just a simple example, it says it is concreting. But does that concreting include the formwork? Does it include striking? Not quite sure. So that has to be investigated and understood. Certainly have to check all the critical path items and anything that's nearly critical, not far off the critical path. You don't necessarily have to check every single date in the program. You might just want to sample some others. Check significant milestones, contract dates are accurate, and show delay events separately if at all possible. Same sort of thing applies to the progress updates. Make sure you've got a full suite of progress updates. Historic data can be checked in the same way as an as-built schedule. Interview site staff again. Forecast data can be checked as per the baseline schedule. And review the logic at each of the updates. Does it remain valid? Comes back to the example I gave about retain logic and progress override. And then you need to review all the changes through the suite of updates. You can perhaps reference the list of variables I provided. Ensure all the data is provided to you, not just what I showed on the graphic of the schedules. There's all sorts of data behind there relating to constraints, the type of constraints, leads, lags, etc. Make sure that's provided to you, and ideally electronically. Finally, we have the validation of delay events themselves. You can do this in one of two ways. You can either start with the documentation, or you might actually go to the schedule and list out where all the variances are and then seek to justify those variances by reference to documentation. Tabulate the source of delay, use the most reliable data. So you might have a site diary that is at odds with some piling records or the clerk of works records. Make sure you use the most reliable or assess it for the most reliable. Identify actual start and finish dates for each delay. Correlate those with the schedule itself. And then we need to be looking at the criticality and the causation of those variances as well. Also account for any existing extensions of time. If you're under an NEC project, you can have a compensation event and that might take, say, 3 months to be implemented, by which time you've submitted 2 further progress schedules. You might have your contract date, completion date shifted retrospectively. So make sure you've taken account of that. Right, I'm just about at the end. Hopefully I'm not going to go over the time, but I just wanted to say that checking all these variables, etc., there's huge amounts of data. It can be rather daunting, but there's a lot of software that can be used to assist. Indeed, most of them are outside here. I've provided an example here of its Acumen Fuse. I've got my example baseline up here in the top left, and it gives me all sorts of feedback and data. It says I've got 10 activities, or 63% are critical. It tells me about insufficient detail. Well, I'm not surprised because my schedule was very basic, but it's highlighting them as red. And it then can actually split those down into time frames as well. And it tells you, well, in this case, I haven't got negative total float, but it tells me how many activities are critical at one particular point in time. And if I click on any one of these, it will break down and show me the actual activities that I might be very interested in looking at. The Acumen, I think, uses the Defence Contract Agency's document that I referred to in the first slide. And it assesses things according to their benchmarks about what's reasonable for a good quality schedule. And it denotes things like the number of activities, the finish to start relationships in your schedule should be at least 90%, or the activities that are missing a predecessor or a successor shouldn't exceed 5% of the activities of the schedule. And that's how it's able to come up with sort of its traffic light system of highlighting areas that are worth investigating forensically. So, in summary, forensic schedule analysis is a retrospective investigation with the benefit of hindsight of the progress of a project on site, what delays have occurred, and who is responsible for those, demonstrating cause and effect. I also want to just again revisit the point that schedules can be distorted for various reasons, which can be accidental, not necessarily willfully, although it perhaps has been a bit more fun looking at some deceptive features in action. You need to validate your baseline, progress updates, the as-built, and correlate that with contemporaneous data, facts, and oral evidence. That's what the forensic schedule analyst can only hope for. Variables mean the opportunity for inaccuracy or deception. So whenever new data is required for the schedule or program, then there's an opportunity there for something to go wrong. You need to review all changes throughout each schedule. So ideally, if you just compared an as-planned with an as-built, you might not pick up on how the delay has manifested itself during the currency of the works. You may actually find that if one party is alleging something is critical because it was in his baseline or it is in his as-built, at the time the delay event occurred, it may not even have been critical because there were preceding delays. And it's actually a very useful check. Just to go back in time to a point where a delay is alleged and just see what activities are due to be carried out in the next 2 weeks. Because you'll often find that the activity alleged as critical isn't even due to be carried out for 2 or 3 months because of preceding delays. Ensure all the information is provided. To get all the information electronically, including the float, the constraints, resources, etc. Records might dictate the extent of the analysis that's possible. If I come in and look at a program and I decide that the baseline project is, the logic is flawed in it, I can't necessarily use that program anymore, and that might dictate that I have to do a collapsed as built analysis. Methods of delay analysis are a topic for another day. And the last one, and I would say this, wouldn't I? If you're unsure, use an expert. Don't necessarily have to come in and assist and do everything for you, but I'm quite happy to come in and provide direction. So, are we? Have I got? I'm there, am I? Yeah. I don't have, like, and beyond. Oh, 2 minutes. Well, I deal in delay, so what did you expect? Okay,